Welcome to the Heroic Voice. This is May 10th, 2025. I'm here with Danny Fingeroth, who is well known in the comic book world for his stint as a Spider-Man editor, as Stan Lee's biographer. But there's much more to Danny than that. This is the Heroic Voice, where I talk to comic book creators and other interesting people on a variety of subjects. I am Dennis Maloney, publisher of the Heroic Multiverse, where we feature good girl and bad girl artwork, super babes, and all kinds of Silver Agey style stories. Right. Danny, you have what I think is an extremely interesting topic for the book that you just released. Let's talk about that.
Well, hi, Dennis. Thank you for inviting me. It was nice to see a familiar face and name, but all I saw was the heroic part of it, and
Well,
should
it's
have known
been a
it was
long
heroic.
time. It's been a long time since we crossed paths, I
I
think.
think so. So,
Yeah.
well, thanks for the intro. I'm. It's been 30 years since I worked on a daily basis at Marvel Comics. So I've been away from Marvel Comics much longer than I was actually there. Although I guess if you count my starting to read Marvel Comics at age 8 with Fantastic Four #4, then it might be that my my entire life history with Marvel and with comics might be longer than the amount of time I've been technically away. But of course, Marvel Comics is the 800-pound gorilla in my resume because it's the most famous thing I did, and and so. But in the years since, I've discovered a second, third, and fourth career as some kind of expert in a variety of topics, starting with comics. And then in recent years, I've moved into writing biographies and then just sort of seeing how far people will take me seriously as a pop culture expert in things like the Marx Brothers, Bob Dylan, and weirdly enough, um, in one particular corner of the Kennedy assassination mythology, which is a whole sector of culture on its own.
Hmm.
So the book you were alluding to is, of course, my biography of Jack Ruby, which came out in hardcover in late 2023 and then came out in paperback in October. So it's, I guess, about 6 months ago. And it had started as a graphic novel project, which might not be that surprising, but I was doing I was again trying to expand beyond the superhero world, expand beyond the Marvel Comics world. And I said, gee, I wonder, um, about 12 years ago, I said, gee, I wonder if anybody's doing any graphic novels about the 50th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination. And weirdly enough, there had been no announcements. It turned out that Dan Mishkin and Ernie Colon had done a graphic novel adaptation of the Warren Commission report, but that had not been announced. So I was working with a old colleague of mine, a great editor and writer himself, named Howard Zimmerman, who some of you may know from his work with Byron Price. And Howard was working as a graphic novel packager, and he put me together with Rick Geary, and we put together this comprehensive. Well, I didn't know exactly what aspect of the Kennedy assassination because I was not one of those people obsessed with it. I always found it too big and too daunting. But since I've become um, sort of a de facto expert on the Jewish angle on comics and then the Jewish angle on popular culture, I started, because a lot having to do with my own background and my own interests. I started researching more about the Kennedy assassination than, I was 10 years old when it happened, when JFK was shot. And I knew there were a million conspiracy theories and they all kind of made my head spin. But in a similar way that I became expert and friends with and interviewed a lot of old Jewish cartoonists, I mean, including I work still for the Will Eisner Studio and Foundation running Will Eisner Week. But because I lived in New York, and because a lot of them did, and because medical science kept them alive longer than it might have in another era, I got to be friends of varying degrees with Al Jaffe, Erwin Hazen, Jerry Robinson, Jules Pfeiffer. And these were people who, when I was working in comics, they were still working. So if I was, I guess I could have asked them about history, asked them about their backgrounds, asked them about ethnicity. But really, I think if I had been a Marvel Comics editor calling a working freelancer in like 1985, I think their attitude, or this, their attitude might well have been, well, if you're not calling to offer me work, don't waste my time. So, but so it's very curious kind of thing. So weird, and one of the reasons I was interested is because their backgrounds were similar to mine. I'm New York Jewish born, my grandchild of immigrants, of Eastern European immigrants, and so a lot of these comic artists could have been my relatives and probably grew up in the same streets as my parents, aunts, uncles, cousins, went to the same schools. Um, and so, and Jack Ruby, weirdly enough, a similar thing is that could, Jack Ruby could have been for anybody, but especially for somebody descended from Eastern European Jewish background, your weirdest cousin, right? I mean, that was, and so I said, well, I wanted to do something about the Kennedy assassination. And the more I studied, I went, oh, well, this Jack Ruby guy is right up my alley. Oh my God. And then I discovered that through somebody I knew personally, I had a connection to Jack Ruby's rabbi. You know the movie Weekend at Bernie's?
Yes.
You know the star of that, Jonathan Silverman? His father was Jack Ruby's rabbi in Dallas. And he just died. Got him Hillel Silverman. He just died a couple of years ago at age 98. Still, still very devoted to the idea there was no conspiracy that Jack acted alone. So Silverman, I interviewed him when I was still thinking of it as a graphic novel, and he says to me, I'm almost 90. I can hardly see. I'm not writing my book anymore. Everybody in the Ruby courtroom was writing a book. He said, would you like to see my notes from when I visited Jack in prison every other day for 4 months from the time from the day after he killed Oswald to like 4 months later? I said, yeah, I wouldn't mind. You know, you know. So that became once I had that, and I didn't even realize what gold it was till I had the. And I mean, I read them and I went, okay. But then as I did more and more and more research, and then, you know, I realized what gold I had. And then the graphic novel project, although Rick Geary was attached to it, we couldn't find anybody really who would pay enough of an advance for Rick to spend 2 years drawing a 200-page graphic novel. Backburnered it. Then I've written a number of prose books, a book, about comics and pop culture, and especially the Stan Lee biography that I wrote in 2019. And so I said to my agent, do you think now that I've written these books, especially a biography, could we do the Ruby biography as prose? And he sold it to Chicago Review Press. And then I really had to research on it. And Ruby's story, look, Ruby changed history. If you're too young to know, it's the classic picture of this kind of portly looking guy. Looks kind of like Jackie Gleason. Looks kind of like, stepping into the frame and shooting the presumed assassin of President Kennedy, Lee Harvey Oswald, changing history, um, changing everything. Ushering in this media era. Um, and Ruby, and again, most people, even people who are alive, then only know that one image. But he was a very, like everybody, he had a life, and he was in show business. Again, most people or many people know that he owned a strip club, and that sort of added an extra level of sleaze to the story.
Jack was well known to Texas law enforcement, to
He
Dallas
was
law
well,
enforcement.
he was well known to everybody because Jack
Yep.
Ruby went out of his way to be known. You know,
Mhm.
Jack Ruby also owned country western clubs, so he was the last person to give regular work to Hank Williams Sr., right? I mean, so all these, and then, and tell me what, I mean, if you want to ask, I'm happy to keep going on with my Ruby stories, but I would just
Well,
say,
feel free. This is very interesting. I'm sure it'll be interesting to people who are viewing this, for heaven's sake.
well, so Ruby was one of 8 siblings, and the question with him and Oswald is not whether they were crazy. They were both out of their minds. The question is, were they lone nuts or not? That, of course, but they were both, you know, absolutely bonkers from bonkers families, and yet, but he had these eight siblings who were all constantly bickering, But when Jack shot Oswald, they all got together and pooled their money, and really only one of them was extremely successful. His brother, his kid brother Earl, was like a dry cleaning magnate in Detroit, and so it's this crazy family story in the middle of this national story, in the middle of of the president being shot. So is World War III going to start if it was the Russians or what, and so all that stuff. And then here's this Jack Ruby family story. Um, and, 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 uh, and then some of the weirdest, I would say my favorite story, and certainly, so I mean, I will say that I'm not smart enough to solve the mysteries of the Kennedy assassination. So I give voice in the book to a number of the more plausible conspiracy theories, and also to the Warren Commission. The Warren Commission definitely seems too simple and too easy that to be true, but all these conspiracy theories require so many simultaneous coincidences and overlapping events. So I'll just tell you my favorite. If you ever listen to Gilbert Gottfried's podcast, Gilbert um, was Gilbert, and one night he had Gabe Kaplan on from Welcome Back, Kotter. And Kaplan told this great story. He might have told it on another podcast, but a great story about auditioning for Jack Ruby. And because Kaplan, I'm not even sure if he finished high school. He became a professional comedian, like as a
Lordy,
teen,
he must have been like in his mid-teens when he did
like
that then.
18, 19. Yeah,
Yeah.
he's 89 or 90 now. So he told this hilarious story, hilarious but chilling story um, about he's in Buffalo performing at a strip club in Buffalo, and one of the dancers there hears that there's work in Dallas. So he drives through the night with like a car full of like crazy strippers, almost getting killed. I may be conflating a couple of stories. Anyway, they drive through the night. They get to Dallas. They meet one mob guy, and he sends them, to meet Ruby, and he auditions for Ruby. And I won't ruin the story. You should really either read my book or go to Gilbert's podcast or go, But it's a hilarious story, and about Kaplan's audition. So cut to 60 years later, and I'm promoting the hardcover version of the book, and I'm speaking to the Dallas Jewish Historical Society, a co-event between the Dallas Jewish Historical Society and the Sixth Floor Museum, which is the old book depository. And there's a guy that looks familiar in the audience, but everybody looks familiar in the audience. It's a bunch of old Jews whose parents and aunts and uncles all knew and worked with Jack Ruby. So I'm thinking, holy shit, I got to get it right for this crowd. And I say, I heard this story on Gilbert Gottfried's podcast. I tell the story. I got a picture of Gabe Kaplan, from the Welcome Back Kotter days. So, I dotted my I's and crossed my T's as far as attributing the story. Okay, goes over well. Nobody says to me, you Yankee, you got it all wrong. Everybody, I'm sitting down, I'm signing books. Luckily, we sold a bunch. That guy who looks familiar comes up. I say, who should I make it out to? He says, make it out to Gabe. A light goes off in my head. I go, listen, let me be sure I have this straight. You're Gabe Kaplan, and you look nothing like you did 50 years ago, but I still knew you were not just one of the typical people. You're Gabe Kaplan. You sat there while I told your story and showed your picture, and now you're buying my book. He said, that is correct. And so,
Oh,
so that's one of the top two surreal stories. And so we went out to dinner, and we're still in touch. He gave me a blurb. That's why there's a blurb from Gabe Kaplan on the paperback version. You
all
know,
right.
he's been mostly a professional gambler, a poker player for the past 40 or 50 years. And sometimes he'll do celebrity uh, uh, um, poker tournaments and stuff, but mostly. and he lives in Dallas part-time, I think maybe for tax reasons, I'm not sure. So, if I was in New York or LA and a celebrity showed up, it's New York or LA, but I was not expecting at the Dallas Jewish Historical Society that Mr. Cotter would, would be show. So that, and I mean, and his story about auditioning for Ruby, it's just, like I said, it's in my book, but if you want to hear him tell it, find Gates, um, Gilbert's podcast. So it's
Right.
been a very, it's been this experiment in my as the years move on. I find that there are enough people in the world who are comic book fans or were comic book fans that they find it interesting that I might want to dabble in Bob Dylan studies or Marx Brothers studies or the Kennedys. I mean, comics are like film in the sense that, they're an amalgam of various art forms and everybody's interested in them and the boundaries, the borders to get in are very porous if you have something to offer. So I do find that I've had I look back and while perhaps the financial end of things have been up and down, I definitely have done a lot of interesting things and met a lot of interesting people. And and the Stan Lee biography, which was what I did. There are many stories behind that, and it was not authorized because some people. Um, I've sometimes been accused. Oh, you Marvel shill. I bet you had to have every word approved by Stan Lee and by Marvel. But no,
No.
nobody had to approve anything except my editor at St. Martin's Press. There was
Public
no
figures are open to biographical treatments.
right, but I think some people assume or want to assume because of my long-term association with Marvel. Um, but no, the Stan biography, although I had tried to get him at one point to have it be authorized, he ultimately turned it down. And then when I told him that I had, yeah, he said to me, you know, what he said to me was, and I printed this email out 20 times. He said, "Do a Kitty Kelly on me," which I don't think he literally meant, but you never know. If anybody doesn't remember, Kitty Kelly did a Frank Sinatra biography, and Sinatra like sued her, and I think
Yeah.
ultimately he lost. But so basically, Stan said, "Do an unauthorized one," but I won't, but I won't do any interviews for it. And of course, I did two lengthy interviews with him for it.
Oh.
Uh, anyway,
Let's step back a minute. The
uh,
focus of the Jack Ruby book. It sounds like you've got several different focuses in here, not just the things around the assassination, but you're talking about the family, right? You're really going into depth into Jack's life, right?
I'm going into depth well, it's a biography, so I'm going to depth on his
Yeah.
life. And I think, look, sort of with the Stan Lee book, it was almost an homage to my own family and background and the industry I spent so many years as a fan of and then working in. And you can't really, you can't really do a biography of almost anybody without painting their life and times. So,
Otherwise, it's not a biography, is it?
right. Well, but there's a fine line. Is it a biography? Is it a history book? Is it you know what I mean? Is it an overview? Because Stan started in the business almost at the beginning of superheroes at age 17,
Hmm.
you know. I mean, there is a certain point where the book veers off from from comic book history because but even so, even when Stan went to Hollywood, there was still, he was still so tied to Marvel, both financially and reputation wise and emotionally. Um, so, so I, that was like, I mean, it's certainly a challenge, but it was basically the Danny Fingeroth history of comics. I mean, that's, featuring Stan Lee as much as it was a story of Stan Lee. And you know, it's also was weird. There were some things where I was involved with things that Stan did. So suddenly I'm writing about my own life and career where it intersects. Because even after I left Marvel, anywhere I went, I was the guy that knew Stan.
Yeah.
So in many ways, I worked more closely with Stan at other companies than I did when I was at Marvel, because I was the guy that knew Stan, you know.
Oh, that's funny.
So with Ruby, it was a you know it was similar but different, you know. I mean, it was a challenge. Obviously, I don't know the, you know, fortunately for me, I'm not as familiar with the Chicago underworld as I am with the Marvel editorial and creative people and history. Um, you know, so I really had to learn a lot about the history of Dallas, the history of Jews in Dallas, the history of politics in that, you know, and and the history of crime. I mean, people, you know. So luckily, um, and again, I figured I'm not solving the mysteries of the Kennedy assassination, but I interviewed the rabbi. I got the notes from the rabbi. I interviewed Ruby's niece and nephew, who for years would not talk to anybody. I interviewed
Congratulations.
that. Well, I mean, I think other people may have, but I think I brought something to it. But thank you. And they were wild interview, you know, and very, you know, imagine you live in Dallas as his nephew did, you know, his brother's son. Your name is Ruby, and you're bragging to all your friends that your uncle owns a strip club because you're 12 years old and your uncle owns a strip club. Suddenly, your crazy uncle kills Lee Harvey Oswald on television, and you got to go to school, you know, 2 days later. So I mean, that's a unique perspective, you know, because Ruby didn't wasn't married, didn't have children, but he had this very intermeshed, you know, you know, I don't know if his family was any crazier than anybody else's, but certainly a very eccentric bunch, you know, um, and they were hiring and firing lawyers, you know, I mean, you know, and a lot of the most famous, you know, lawyers in the country. So, and then I also spoke to the children of the other Jewish strip club owners in Dallas who, you know, kind of thought Ruby, even in that business, thought he was a lowlife, you know. I mean, I would say that writing the book, I went into it thinking that maybe he was like Ralph Cramden, just maybe Ralph Cramden lost his temper a little, but he was not he. Although there were many people who loved him, and many people who either interviews with me or interviews just they did at other places. As a, you know, there's a whole. Um, I'll tell you about interviews in a second, but you know, a lot of people wanted you to know that they were Jack Ruby's best friend. It was a weird thing.
Weird.
You know,
Yeah.
everybody makes fun of the Warren Commission and, you know, or ridicules it. But whatever you may think of their conclusions, they did an extraordinary amount of research, and there's hundreds of interviews they did. And then at the sixth floor museum, again, there's, you know, many, you know, thousands of interviews of people, you know, non-famous people, just people. You know, so if you want to create a picture of that scene, not to mention the court transcripts, and so I mean, you can argue and justifiably with conclusions that the Warren Commission came up with, but holy cow, they did their home. You know, there is a ton. You know, now how how accurate or how dependable the testimony of an imprisoned accused murderer on death row in Dallas in 1963 is, you have to, you know, what's their motivation? You know, you have to read between the lines with a lot of these things, but boy, there is a lot of stuff out there. That's the problem. That's in a way the problem with investigating the Kennedy assassination. There's so much data, you can support any conclusion you want.
Anything you want. Got a question for you. Talking about motivation. Um, what did you, how do I phrase this? Um, you probably have several different ideas on what Jack Ruby's motivation might have been, right? And given all of the testimony you received, different people have different ideas. What do you think are the leading perceptions of why Jack Ruby did what he did?
Here's what I used to think when I was just starting to study it, and I, you know, I mean, not to belittle comics or graphic novels, because you know they are my, you know, my in my bloodstream, but you know, you can write a credible historic graphic novel, and because you have images, you can leave much of the judgment of an evaluation to the reader, really to the artist, but then to the reader. So I would say, while I certainly did a lot of research for the graphic novel when it became, plus 10 more years of just thinking about it and reading about it. But when it came to do the prose biography, you know, I had, again, maybe in this Jackie Gleason sort of thought, that I thought he wanted to be the Jew that killed the guy that killed the president, and in some weird way be doing public relations for the Jewish people. And actually, he got a lot of fan mail. People don't realize this. So in a weird kind of way, he succeeded, although I think ultimately not. But so I thought that was because Jack was very concerned about anti-Semitism in general, and especially in Dallas at that point in history. Just studying Dallas is a very interesting thing because it had elements of a progressive northern city and elements of a totally
Totally
conservative
southern. Yeah.
southern city, and they were, constantly butting up against each other. So that was sort of my kind of almost, I don't know about idealized, but my sort of romantic vision of Ruby. Um, you read enough theories, and even, you know, it, I think a scenario that I think is plausible, because Jack Ruby had never been arrested or convicted of murder. He was once questioned in a murder where he happened to be in the room. Stuff happens. But he was a leg breaker. He was a tough guy. He used to go beat up Nazis, in the late 30s who were having meetings. Him and his best friend, boxer Barney Ross, who was like, was a very when boxing was a Jewish sport. Ross was one of the most famous boxers in the country, and he was childhood. That's another weird Ruby connection, childhood. So when so Ruby, so there's a lot of motivation, but he was not a killer. He was not a hitman. He was never even accused. Although, like I said, he got in a lot of fights. He'd often come home from, going out to a bar and come home with blood on his clothes from, if somebody made a wisecrack or an anti-Semitic remark, he would beat the shit out of them. Um, However, I think it's possible. Plus, he was nuts, so he's not a guy he's not your first choice as a hitman. But I think it's possible that somebody wanted Oswald eliminated and maybe put the word out to 10 different people,
Mm-hmm.
even threatened their families. Because when he was in prison, was obsessed with his family coming to harm. He, there was a, Ruby was obsessed in the 3 years in the 3+ years he was in jail as the softest target in the world, and nobody tried to kill him. But he was obsessed with harm coming to his family, and that he had started the second Holocaust. He was somehow believed he went from thinking he was a hero. So it is possible that the word went out. Anybody gets close to Oswald, you know, um, take a shot at him, and we'll kill your family or hurt your family. So maybe Ruby was one of 10 guys who somehow were, because he was trying to get in when they were questioning Oswald on Friday night. But then he did everything else possible to call attention to himself. That whole weekend, he was so conspicuous, and so, if you think of a hitman as being like a cool, collected guy who stalks in the shadows, Ruby was the opposite. I mean,
Not your archetype for that
oh my,
role.
and I mean, and just like all, because I think in a way he saw himself as the mayor of downtown Dallas.
Hmm.
I never heard anybody specifically say that, but he clear, as part of his personality and as part of, when you think of strip clubs, I think we have a certain impression of strip clubs now, and that obviously existed in the early '60s, but they were more like what we think of as burlesque, and
Yeah. Yeah.
they were comedians and singers, and so they weren't and a lot of college students would go. His club, it's weird. His club was in a part of Dallas that
It's a risque nightclub. That's
was
what
a
it was.
nightclub, right? Exactly, and
Yeah.
and 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 there was a lot of stuff. And right across, I mean, I guess maybe it's like Old Times Square in New York. right across the street from like the fanciest hotel in the city, the Adolphus Hotel, where politicians would. So a lot of showbiz people perform for Ruby. You know, he had he made it his business to try to stay in good terms. He was a big busybody,
Hmm.
and look, he also might have been. There's a lot of he might have been, right? Mobsters don't have membership cards, so he was probably mob affiliated. He probably did a lot of, it's possible he was involved in drug smuggling. His siblings were arrested for it, but again, not convicted. He's all over the map and with friends in high and low places. I
He had a
mean,
lot of fingers in various different fires, it sounds like, into
and
everything. Yeah.
and and, and the easy thing to say is nobody took him seriously, but I don't think that's quite true. I think people saw him as a useful buffoon, and some people, I mean, he would hire and fire the same dancers and bartenders, like just endlessly, hire them,
Mhm.
fire them. He was very closely associated with a stripper named Candy Barr, who was Mickey Cohen's girlfriend. Um, and there's the whole thing of was Jack gay or not, a million different. With all my research, Ruby claimed that to have had sex with like he claimed that he had sex with every stripper who auditioned. Oh no, he tried to have sex with a stripper auditioned, and if they agreed to have sex with him, he fired them. You know,
He's got standards or ethics
that's
or
standard.
something.
But I've never seen anybody, man or woman, actually say I went to bed with Jack Ruby.
Well, Danny, I think we've whetted people's appetite for this book. Um, let's do this. You've got a website. Let's point people to it because you've got a lot of other things up there too.
Sure. DannyFingeroth.com. Pretty clever, eh?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's astonishing. What about social media? What about social media? Can people follow you on
Facebook.
Facebook or
I'm an old guy, so Facebook is my main thing. But I'm also on Blue Sky and Instagram. But Facebook would be your best bet to get a hold of me.
and very quickly, we mentioned the Stan Lee biography. You've got a couple of other books. There's a Superman book, as I recall,
Oh,
right? And
Superman on the Couch, it's over 20 years old already, and it was the believe it or not, it was the first book since Wortham to take superhero psychology seriously. And a lot of other people have written books. Travis Langley always very graciously, mentions me having inspired him to write this whole line of superhero psychology books that he's written and edited and continues to. Dr. Travis Langley. Um, and a lot of people at conventions will come up to me and say, oh, thanks to your book, I was able to write my bachelor's, master's, doctoral thesis. And then I wrote a book focusing more narrowly called Disguised as Clark Kent, Jews, Comics, and the Creation of the Superhero, which, again, many people think is, the best book on that topic. And then the Stan Lee biography, of course, which, you know, um, I think that I wrote a pretty, I hate to use the expression fair and balanced, but I think, I think I wrote a pretty even-handed biography of Stan. What I didn't do was if I wrote about something he did that wasn't so wonderful, I didn't put neon arrows and loud background
yeah,
music. I thought I gave my readers credit for being intelligent enough to figure out when this thing I'm describing was maybe not the nicest thing. Um,
no
and
editorial judgments then.
I tried not to, and look, I liked Stan a lot, but I was, well aware of his flaws and
Likewise, yeah, I loved Stan, but
you know.
he was difficult at times.
And the
That
other thing, and his,
memory, he had no memory. So yeah,
yeah, except when he did,
yeah, except when he
but a
did.
lot of the
Yeah.
time. Because whatever. When I interviewed him for the book, I got some of the last interviews with Stan for my book for the Stan for A Marvelous Life, and I just figured, there's no point. What am I going to go? And what about you and Jack? What was the point? What? So I just tried to ask him about stuff from his life and career, and I guess like all of us, he remembers some things. He doesn't remember other things. But many of your listeners, viewers know that his brother still alive.
Yes, Larry. We should mention Larry. You've got
So
quickly, quickly, because we are
Okay,
running out of time.
Larry Lieber has written his first prose novel, and for numerous reasons, we've self-published it under the name Concourse Publishing. It's called Chirps. It's an action adventure YA novel. I think it's great. Many people just think it's terrific. Larry's done a lot of podcasts lately. You can look him up and talk to him about it. Maybe if you'd like him to do this one, I can talk to him about it. It's available on Amazon as a hardcover and also as a digital book, Amazon, Barnes and Noble. If you prefer to go to an independent store or a comic store, they can all order them very easily. It's called Chirps, and he's written under the name Lawrence Lieber.
I would love to have Larry on here. If you can, make a contact for me, I'd greatly appreciate it.
Send me an email, and
I will do that.
yeah, um, I'll tell you more about it. Okay, great. Well,
All righty. Thank you. Thank you for coming.
my
Um,
pleasure.
I want to encourage people to go to your website. As we said, it's very clever, DannyFingeroth.com. And I want to encourage people, if they like this interview, to like it, to subscribe, and to share this, because I this is a topic we've not covered on the Heroic Voice. And I hope it's the start of branching off into things other than comic books. Thank you so much for
It
being
can be
here.
helpful. All right, thank you, Dennis. Take care.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna.